This video is brought to you by World of Tanks. It's a lot of fun, free to play, and if you use my link, you'll start out with a ton of exclusive perks. More on that at the end of the video. Around the year 1044, as a Yuletide frost crept over the north, King Magnus of Norway brought fire and death to Denmark. Thralls abandoned the burning halls of their fallen masters. Men were slain before their kin, their wives and children carried away as plunder. The invaders sought the rebel Jarl called Svein, for the Danes had raised him as their sovereign king to supplant the foreign rule of King Magnus. Upon the death of Canute the Great and later Canute's son, King Magnus had inherited a claim to the thrones of England and Denmark, and though he would not insist on pursuing the former, his reign over the latter was now recognized in blood and ash. Spain's warriors lay scattered throughout the land, drifting dead in the cold tide or crouched in shadowed woods. Svein found refuge at the friendly court of the King of Sweden, and Magnus the Good was hailed as the true and noble king of Norway and Denmark. Talk of post-mortem miracles surrounded his late father, the fervent Christian King Olaf, revered now as a saint. So great were the armies of Magnus, so holy his claim to the throne, that there seemed none left in all the land to oppose him. A gale howled over the seas, waves swelled before a stranger ship. Here sailed the bane of great kings, a Viking long ago banished from this land. Uncle to Magnus, brother to Saint Olaf. This was the mercenary Harald Sigurdsson, returned to take the crown of Norway. He sojourned at the Swedish court, and there he unloaded strange and innumerable treasures. For roughly 15 years had passed since he fled Scandinavia, from that battlefield where his brother Olaf fell, and he had since won glory and riches in the land of the Rus and the Byzantine Empire, as the hired champion of princes and emperors. That autumn, when Magnus and his men were along the coasts, they were struck by the approach of Harald's magnificent ship. King Magnus received his uncle with guarded cordiality. The Grand Prince of Kiev had recently betrothed his fair daughter Elisaveta to Harald, and so it was seen that Harald possessed riches greater than King Magnus himself, a wife of status, and a blood claim to the throne. Harald asked Magnus how he wished to divide the rule of Norway between them. Magnus answered that he was obliged to consult with his advisors on the matter. His chief advisor then stepped forward. This old enemy of Olaf, Einar Thumbar-Skelfir, chastised Harald. "We are not keen to be divided between two kings. We have always served one king, and so it must remain for as long as King Magnus continues to reign." Harald returned in shame to Sweden. If his enemies would not see him as king, they would suffer him as a warrior. Dragon ships cast onto the shore, and Northmen swept over the land at the command of Svein and Harald. The two men had sworn an oath of allegiance. Together they would seize Denmark for Svein and Norway for Harald. Towns became screaming pyres. They hacked men to death and tore wailing women from lowly huts. And it was said, "Few were they of escape to tell, for sorrow-worn the people fell. The only captives from the fray were lovely maidens led away, and in wild terror to the strand, down to the ships the linked band of fair-haired girls is roughly driven, their soft skins by the irons riven." Tidings of war reached Magnus, and the king's council did not think it wise to oppose Harald. and so messengers passed in secret between Magnus and Harald to negotiate the co-rulership of Norway between them. Svein suspected betrayal. He attempted to assassinate Harald in his sleep, but Harald escaped, and at long last he was crowned King Harald III of Norway. As co-ruler, Magnus insisted on being the primary king, granted precedence in courtly matters and ritual. Magnus was beloved by his people for his leniency and generosity, and for this Harald resented him as weak and childish. The two insulted each other with impunity, but still a greater danger united them. They moved against Svein in Denmark, and there, in the fall of the year 1047, Magnus was said to have been gripped by an illness. With his waning strength, Magnus declared that the sole rule of Norway would pass to Harald, and Denmark given over to Svein. King Magnus the Good then died. Harald did not think himself bound by the wishes of dying kings. At once he made preparations to move with haste against Svein and claim the throne of Denmark. But in the king's assembly, Einar openly declared that he himself would return to bury Magnus in Norway, and that he would rather serve Magnus dead than any other king alive. The fighting men loyal to the chieftain Einar were so numerous and his influence so great that Harald had little choice but to tolerate such treasonous speech and return to assert his rule over Norway. For the high thrones of Scandinavia had not entirely supplanted the power of the Viking halls. Kings were still obliged to reckon with the old war clans of every region. Svein was raised as the king of the Danes, and when Harald went to ravage Denmark in the summer, Svein eluded capture. Harald returned to Norway and married a second wife, Thora of the influential Arnesen family. While his wives would bear him children to be raised as heirs to Norway, the king's gaze turned ever south. In 1050, he returned to terrorize Denmark. His Vikings tore over farmland, ruined villages, and burned churches. They tortured people to death, violated women, and burned the trading post of Hedeby. When Svein at last met Harald with a massive army, Harald fled. In Norway, Harald moved to punish and assassinate those who questioned his rule. Yet Einar stood at the head of a mighty faction of chieftains who freely decried the king's butchery. At length, Harald requested a meeting with Einar to resolve the matter. Einar stepped alone into the king's chamber and remarked how dark the room was. A few of Harald's men then emerged from the shadows and killed him. Einar's son rushed in to the aid of his father, and they killed him too. The people came to despise King Harald, and there was wide talk of rebellion among the farmers. The king tasked his ally, Finn Arnesen, to entreat them to peace. Finn requested the king offer something in exchange for so dangerous a quest: the safe return of his brother, Kulf. Kulf Arnesen was the greatest traitor to Harald's house. He was said to have personally killed Olaf. When Magnus learned of this crime years ago, Kulf fled into exile to the Norwegian domains along the northern edge of Scotland. Harald now welcomed Kulf back to Norway and restored him to his old estates. Then, in the summer, King Harald went on campaign in Denmark and demanded that Kulf make the first assault against the Danish position. Only after Kulf was overrun and killed with his men did Harald land with reinforcements. Finn and all the people saw plainly the treachery of their vengeful king. Harald wrote that he took pride in having given the death stroke to 2 more of his enemies. The king burned and pillaged regions whose fealty wavered, and there were rumors that he stole offerings set by the faithful at the tomb of Saint Olaf. Though he raised great churches and the kingdom outwardly prospered, the people in coming centuries would know him as Hardrada, the hard ruler. For years he shed the blood of so many foes, but still the hated Svein of Denmark remained. Harald commanded 150 longships south, plundering shores which in those days belonged to the Danes. Then, near the mouth of the river Nisa, the men were taken by the sight of a fleet twice their size. Spain had come to answer the king's challenge to war. In this land, the late summer sun lingers long in the sky, and the embers of twilight burn on the horizon even in the darkest hour. In the shadowy haze, Harald stirred his men to battle. Each fleet was lashed together with ropes and chains to hold the lines, and they crashed forward. Arrows and spears were flung into shields, chests, and heads. Untethered Norwegian ships then outflanked the Danes, and a slaughter began on the decks. The Danes threw themselves overboard, and Harald took 70 of their ships. In the sea of gashed bodies, his warriors captured alive Finn Arneson, who had betrayed Harald to serve Svein. Harald decided to spare him. At any rate, King Svein had escaped the battle and regrouped. The two kingdoms had been drained by war, and within 2 years, Harald brokered unconditional peace with Svein. Harald would remain in Norway, content to maim and kill the people of defiant regions. And in this manner, he gained peace in his country by blood and fear. The king would spend quiet hours composing poetry, pondering his own legacy. He may have heard tales of the distant Norsemen who reached North America some decades ago. He himself had journeyed far south as a mercenary. And as king, he explored north into glacial seas beyond the map's edge, realms surely host to wild beasts and ancient monsters. Of his voyages, it was written, "The king finally had to turn back when the extreme limit of the world disappeared in fog before his eyes. He barely escaped the gaping ravine of the abyss." Harald had lived 50 winters, and the days of glorious and terrible war might have seemed but memories to an aging king. Yet one day a traveler came to his court. He was Tostig Godwinson, or an envoy on his behalf. Tostig had until recently ruled in the Kingdom of England as the Earl of Northumbria, but he had been a harsh ruler, and when the people rebelled against him, his rival brother Harald Godwinson succeeded in having him banished. And upon the death of the childless King Edward, the English High Council crowned Harald Godwinson the King of England. The jealous brother Tostig sought retribution, imploring Harald of Norway to conquer the country, to redeem Magnus's old claim to the English throne. Harald Hardrada could become the Viking King of England, and Tostig would regain land and power as his vassal. So Harald prepared an army. In dreams, dark omens came to the King of Norway and his followers. One man saw a great battle in England, and before him a witch riding a wolf. With bloody jaws her beast devoured the carcasses of Harald's men, and she sang, "The troll woman sees clearly the doom awaiting Harald." Grassy cliffs pulled high and quiet over the sea and sloped into little dwellings where people beheld a scowling fleet bearing an army of around 10,000 warriors. Harald and his Vikings buttressed by Tostig and some of his allies. Towns submitted to them readily, and when the village of Skartaborg stood against them, the Vikings tossed burning wood onto their houses and slaughtered the people. The invaders proceeded inland by river, far from the gaze of King Harald Godwinson, who was perched in the south with his army, anticipating an invasion from another claimant to the English crown, William, Duke of Normandy. The Normans themselves were the descendants of Viking raiders, who over a century ago gained land along the French coast, mixing with indigenous Franks and adopting much of their customs. For now, Harald met little resistance as his army neared the great city of York, whose weathered walls and towers were the traces of ancient times, when this country belonged to the shining legions of Rome. The English would not now cower behind its walls. A On September 20th, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria led their armies against the Viking horde near the marshlands. The invaders pummeled them wildly, and the corpses of Englishmen were scattered about the wet grass. Survivors fled. York and the whole of Northumbria resolved to surrender. The nobles would be spared violence, but made to guarantee their loyalty by offering their children to be held as hostages by the Vikings. And so, on September 25th, Harald took 2/3 of his army, and leaving their mail armor behind due to the hot weather, they marched to the site chosen for the exchange of hostages, Stamford Bridge. A cloud of dust appeared in the distance. Having trekked 200 miles in 4 or 5 days, here was King Harald Godwinson and a great English army. Harald of Norway sent riders to summon the remaining third of his army over an hour's ride away. The English pushed onto the bridge. English chronicles would later tell that when his countrymen had fallen, one Viking held the bridge alone for some time, slaying dozens of English before he was killed. Farther back, Harald Hardrada rode before his army, shouting that though they lacked armor, their hearts were fearless. The men rallied shield to shield in a ring, spears planted forward, archers ready. The English cavalry charged and the Vikings repulsed them. The English infantry then crashed upon the edges, but the line held strong. At length the English retreated, and when the Viking front roared in pursuit, the English turned around to rush the gaps in their ranks. In this bloodied swelter, hewn limbs and heads piled underfoot, and dying screams rang out. Harald of Norway took up his rageful sword and slashed at his foes. It was said, neither helmet nor armor could withstand him, and all who were nearest gave way before him. And then an arrow struck through his throat, and King Harald Sigurdsson fell dead. His men did not surrender. Of them it was written, the gallant men who saw him fall would take no quarter, one and all, resolved to die with their loved king around his corpse in a corpse ring. The late arrival of reinforcements did not shift the tide of battle. Tostig was found dead with an arrow through his eye, and only a handful of ships loaded with shaken survivors would make the journey home to Norway. The English tended to their wounds and gathered the dead. It seemed King Harald Godwinson had saved England, yet 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William, Duke of Normandy, invaded with thousands of mighty warriors. The king hastened south with some of his army, and at the Battle of Hastings, the Normans vanquished the weary English. Harald Godwinson was killed, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings. William would cast out the old aristocracy, massacre rebels, and put himself on the throne. Now came the days of a new line of kings, a new age in England. The power of the crown was strengthened. Warfare would change, as hundreds of grand castles rarely seen before in this land were raised. England would grow closer to continental Europe, and more close to the depredations of Scandinavia. Svein would twice attempt Danish invasions of England and fail. And the body of King Harald Hardrada was returned to Norway, and the throne passed to his sons. He would be remembered in song and saga as cruel and avaricious, and adventurous, wise, and valiant. The last howl of a dark, brave, and wild age. Alright, watch this. I'm actually decent at World of Tanks. I just outflanked the other team, took out a couple tanks, and won the game. It's all free to play, and if you're a first-time player on the Wargaming portal like I was, click the link in the description and you'll get a week of premium access for free. And on top of that, you'll get the Tier 5 Excelsior, 250,000 credits, and then 3 Tier 6 rental tanks for 10 battles each, the Tiger 131, Cromwell B, and T-3485M. The tanks are actually based on historical tanks, so it feels like history meets action. It's available on console, PC, and mobile, and right now is actually the perfect time to sign up. Until January 9th, there's a Holiday Ops event offering tons of special tanks, items, prizes, and more. So again, just click that link in the description, sign up, and hey, maybe I'll bump into you online.